When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. It's not the end of the world. It's a phrase we use to calm people's fears and to help them get their worries about a possible future event into perspective. Jesus is trying to do the same for his inner core of disciples in today's gospel. When they ask, when will all these things be accomplished? Jesus realizes that they need guidance. So he tells them, the temple will be destroyed, and yes, there will be wars and famines, but such things are literally not the end of the world. The main concern of Jesus is to act as the shepherd of his flock and to show them that the destruction of the temple is not the end of the world. They and the church will go on. There will be a world without the temple. Like Jeremiah before him, Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and of the city itself, and says that this must happen as part of God's mysterious plan. Had he not cleansed the polluted temple, an act which led directly to his death? And now he prophesies the destruction of the temple. And a garbled version of the words we heard in this passage will be quoted against him at his trial, alleging that he said, I will destroy this temple. The message of Jesus is that a better state of affairs can only come about after the destruction of the temple. This is the message of this long sermon of Jesus, of which we just heard the opening part. So, neither the destruction of the temple, nor wars, famines, and earthquakes mean that the end of the world has come. This chapter in St. Mark's Gospel is quite different from the rest of the Gospel. Today's Gospel from Mark chapter 13 is where we sign off from St. Mark's Gospel. Next week, the feast of Christ the King, we hear from St. John's Gospel. And the next Sunday after that, which is the first Sunday in Advent, we begin the year of Luke, when Luke's Gospel will provide each Sunday's Gospel for the whole of the following year, apart from Easter time and some Sundays in Lent. So back to today. Mark chapter 13 is a complicated passage and falls very strangely on our ears. However, it's a fitting reading from which to take our leave from the Gospel of Mark, because in it, Jesus is giving a kind of farewell discourse to his disciples before his final week on earth. In it, Jesus is speaking like one of the prophets of the Old Testament. He speaks of historical events to be accomplished within 40 years of his death, namely, the events of the Jewish War of AD 70, culminating in the destruction of the temple. But also, he does speak of the end of the world itself. Sometimes it's hard to work out exactly which of the two is the main focus in any passage or sentence. But however strange the words or concepts, we should not reject a passage like this. Basically, Jesus is saying that only God is eternal. And he's also saying that wars, famines, and earthquakes are part of the way the world is. We don't know why, but we have to accept the world as it is. Jesus has practical words of advice for his disciples' confused minds and troubled hearts, just like he has in John chapter 14, where in a similar vein and in similar circumstances and in a similar point in time, he says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." He is trying to give them the longest possible perspective. He shifts their attention away from the destruction of the temple in the historical near future to a much longer perspective. We also live in a world where there are many terrifying events and many people are afraid of the future. These words of Jesus can comfort and guide us too. There will be wars, famines, and earthquakes. Terrible though they are for those who suffer because of them, they do not mean that the end of the world has arrived. We live in a world where violence strikes terror into our hearts. But Jesus is calling us not to lose all sense of proportion, not to give way to despair, pessimism, or hysteria. That means we must not allow people to play upon our fears about the state of the world or events in the world. This world, though our home, and though possessed of great beauty, is not perfect. Human beings, though capable of great goodness, of great moral beauty, are not perfect either. Today's words of Jesus are reminding us of some such basic truths. The final point we may draw from this passage is that God is not restricted or defined by religion either. So whilst, like the disciples, we admire the wonderful buildings of the past, especially ancient churches and cathedrals, Jesus is reminding us that God is not tied to or restricted by them. The main purport of what Jesus is saying is that historical events, the rise and fall of buildings, but yes, of empires and civilizations too, are a pointer to the fact that this world itself is contingent, not eternal. So what Jesus is saying is that however strong and large the stones, even of a temple, appear, they are part of a world which is subject to change and decay. Only God and his kingdom last forever. The Christian faith believes that Jesus himself is the new temple, the dwelling place of God's eternal presence, and the church as his body comprises living stones, that is, you and me. Jesus remains the eternal Son of God, the place where God and humanity meet, and believing in him will be our source of strength, safety, and security. Positively, and in the broadest possible terms, this passage tells us that the ministry of Jesus and his disciples and his followers has a future, that what follows in the story of Jesus, his death and resurrection, will give birth to a new age, and that we who are faithful will participate in that new age. The end of the world may not have happened yet, but for the people of God, we are already living in a world where, through the death and resurrection of Jesus and the gift of the Spirit, a new age has begun. So this is a passage of comfort and hope amidst the struggles we face in a far from perfect world. The message is: persevere, keep the faith. God in Christ is in control, but our task is to remain calm and act as citizens of the world to come, whilst continuing to accept both good and bad in the present world, which remains God's gift to us.